Correia. I'm very honored to be here. I want to thank Sylvia for inviting me. Frank, I'd rather be in the audience listening to Sylvia than listening to myself talk, but I'll do my best. Thank you for UNM-Taos and SMU-Taos, and I'm particularly honored to share the bill with Ramon, whose work really influenced me as well. I was asked to talk about, among many things, Nuevomexicano identity. Of course, to talk about that means we're talking about Spanish and Mexican land grants. And if you're from New Mexico, or if you may be a land grant heir yourself, or if you've spent any time in New Mexico, you know that land grant history in New Mexico is the water that still nourishes northern New Mexico's politics, or perhaps we might say that drowns it. And to extend that metaphor, water politics, like land grant politics, can be confusing, unpredictable. We're constantly fighting over it, contesting ownership and meaning, fighting over dates and claims that stretch back hundreds and hundreds of years. So it seems worthwhile to me, at least to me, to start a conversation over land grants by defining what these are. What purpose did they serve when they were created? And so here's the history of land grants in 3 sentences. These are the first 3 sentences of my book, Properties of Violence, by the way. And by the way, when you simplify it like this, you're bound to start a fight, so that's fine. So this quote, when Spain in the 17th century and later Mexico in the early 19th century pushed colonial settlements north into lands controlled by powerful Indian nations in what is today northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, they did so by distributing millions of acres in scores of large common property land grants to landless sheepherders and agriculturalists. Over the course of more than 200 years, Spain and Mexico launched thousands of settlers into a remote territory dominated by the Utes, the Navajo, the Comanches, and the Apaches. Colonial administrators did this because they viewed these borderland settlements as human shields that could guard valuable mining regions south of Santa Fe from powerful Indian nations, unquote. So there are 2 things I think we could think about from this passage. First, common property land grants in New Mexico served first the security interests of elites, not the poor people that moved north. It was a kind of wall of poor people protecting the colony from these more powerful Indian nations. And many of them died as a result. And second, these poor people in those Spanish and Mexican land grants had much more in common with the Utes, the Navajo, the Comanche, and the Apache than they did with the Spanish elites who sent them there. And there's 2 reasons why I think this might be true. First, most of the people who settled the grants north of Abiquiu, and my book focuses, as Sylvia said, on Tierra Amarilla, so I'm thinking about this region. Most of the people that settled the grants north of Abiquiu were the children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of former Indian slaves, kidnapped or bartered for by Spanish traders, and eventually used as fodder in a ferocious war against native nations. Abiquiu, for example, was abandoned in the mid-18th century and resettled by Genízaro Indians, or detribalized Indians, which is just a colonial euphemism for slave. And it was Abiquiu, this place settled by those slaves and children of slaves, from which most of the 18th century Spanish and Mexican land grants in that part of New Mexico were derived, including Tierra Amarilla. And second, I think it would be wrong to say that these Spanish and Mexican land grants dispossessed native people of their land. There were surely violent conflicts between Spain and later Mexico and various Indian nations. Many of those conflicts were brutal and bloody skirmishes committed by militias, many of whom were comprised of land grant settlers. Genízaro or not, they participated in the efforts to remove Utes, particularly Utes and Apaches, from what became the Tierra Amarilla land grant. But the Utes and the Navajo and the Apaches and the Comanches were far more powerful in New Mexico at the time than Spain and later Mexico ever was. The violent dispossession of Indian nations in New Mexico was, in the end, not a Spanish or Mexican accomplishment. It was the United States and its militias and Indian agents who fully dispossessed Tierra Amarilla from Ute and Apache control. before then turning their attention to Spanish and Mexican claimants in the territory. The treaty that ended the US-Mexican War, however, should have produced a different outcome. It committed the US to recognizing all pre-existing property claims, but courts rejected most of the Spanish and Mexican claims and speculators acquired the rest. And this history of wholesale dispossession was quickly buried in the conscience of New Mexicans, and buried quite deeply. When Reyes Lopez Tijerina and his group Alianza organized land grant heirs in the 60s, demanding the return of millions of acres, the response was many, but it included bemusement on the part of many officials. Myra Ellen Jenkins, who was the state historian at the time, was asked about these fantastic claims that Tijerina was making by a reporter once, and she famously responded by calling anyone who'd make such a claim a con artist, and the story of land grants as just a myth. They never existed, she said. Now, while the state historian was bad at history, she wasn't wrong about the persistence of myth in histories of New Mexico's Spanish and Mexican land grants. The persistence of myth in how we understand this land grant history continues to bedevil, in my view at least, all of our efforts to find a just outcome in the present to the violent dispossession in the past. And there are two myths in particular I want to examine tonight. I want to hold them up to scrutiny and just get rid of them once and for all. The first is the way that land grant dispossession is usually explained in the historiography of New Mexico's land grant history. Almost always, the dispossession of Spanish and Mexican land grants is explained as a result of the collision of two incompatible property regimes, two incompatible legal systems. The fee simple American private property system that arrives in 1848, and the common property system that is depicted as describing the Spanish and later Mexican form of property relations that existed prior to the arrival of the United States. Right? These two are depicted as being incompatible, completely incommensurable, and as a result, the collision of these two caused dispossession. Now, this version and the historians who have traded in this story usually admit that there were some speculators up to no good and the courts didn't understand and injustice was the result, but there is a kind of inexorability to the process of dispossession that comes along with the idea of this collision. Now, the second myth is almost a function of the first one. Right? If the first myth defines land grant dispossession as having happened because of the collision of two competing and incompatible and contradictory forms of property and law, then dispossession was an event that happened in the mid to late 19th century. If you're interested in New Mexico land grants, or if you're interested in New Mexico land grant dispossession or resistance to dispossession, you're interested only in the past, in events that happened 150 years ago. Now, I think if you look closely at these two myths and how they work, they're both stories about property. The first myth is ultimately about what the imagined distinction between private and common property, always imagined as completely opposite to one another, tell us about Spain and Mexico and later the United States, right? And the second myth relies on the idea that property is a kind of independent variable, an object, that caused land grant dispossession. And this is not just, in my view, theorizing. I think that has a lot to do with how, not just how we talk about land grants, but what land grant politics look like and what these claims look like and how we respond to them. So I want to spend the rest of my talk examining these two myths in detail. And in order to do that, I think we have to start by thinking differently about property. So let me start with another definition. I want to define what I mean when I say property. Because it seems, I think, often self-evident. Property is kind of the order of things. But I think our inability, our refusal to really scrutinize property, and particularly property law, is part of our problem and makes land grant histories and land grant dispossession difficult to talk about. The law describes real property as conferring a set of rights over land to an owner. The usual metaphor to describe those rights is that they're a bundle of sticks conferred by law to a legitimate owner, and those rights include the right to hold land, the right to sell land, the right to rent land, and the right to exclude others from your land. And those rights are enforced by an authority, usually the state. In this sense, property defines a relation between an owner and a thing, a person or an entity and an object, a piece of land. But as the legal geographer Nicholas Blomley notes, property is, quote, a bundle of sticks with which one can beat one's neighbor, unquote. In this sense, and I think he's absolutely right, property is not only a legal right that defines a relationship between a person and an object, but is also a set of social relations among people enforced by the state. So we're not only talking about a relationship between me and the object I claim, but we're also talking about the relations between me and everyone else that I have the right to either exclude or include in that relationship. Property, in other words, is about social ordering. Who gets what and who gets excluded and how that exclusion happens. And the how is kind of important, it turns out. Law, in order to be lawful, must be enforceable. And enforcement doesn't just imply violence, it requires it. Property, any kind of property, can only be said to exist if the rights it confers, particularly the right to exclude, is enforced. And the difference between an owner and a trespasser is the difference between an owner's right to use legitimate violence in excluding others and the trespasser's lawlessness. Now, I'll return briefly to the question of legitimate violence, although I make a much broader argument in my book and root it in the historical record, and we could talk more about it in the Q&A. But for now, let's just consider what this definition might suggest about that first land grant myth, the collision. This myth about the collision. What exactly is colliding? It's a metaphor, obviously, and metaphors have a way of organizing our thinking in a way that makes it sometimes impossible to think beyond the logic of the metaphor. And there is a subtext here to this metaphor of the collision, right? It describes a collision between ultimately an ancient regime and the modern world. The backwardness of common property versus the progress represented by private property. Common property, the domain of the old world, right? Spain and Mexico. Private property, the domain of the new world, and progress, the United States. It's not for nothing that we find the valorization of and the legal right to private property at the heart of United States colonial governance in New Mexico. Territorial administrators in New Mexico obsessed over what they saw as the lack of private property in New Mexico. Everywhere they looked, they found no private property. And therefore, they found no modernity. They found no progress. And to them, it harmed New Mexico's prospects to entice private investment and ultimately development. The common property that appeared to define Spanish colonial New Mexico and indigenous nations in New Mexico was the very thing that they thought stood in opposition to progress. And this view has really persisted, and in totally contradictory ways. In the 18th century, this view of land grants as organized around common property and therefore backwards was the way speculators and territorial administrators rationalized the dispossession of community land grants, right? The speculators weren't always under the table. This wasn't often covert. They just stole land sometimes and they said it's for the good of the people we're stealing it from. But in the 20th century, and even recently, particularly after the emergence of an organized land grant movement in New Mexico, this collision and this difference in what it represented got recast in a romantic light. Land grant common property was romanticized as perhaps a more just way to organize ourselves. Land grants reflected a more egalitarian way of being, a way that encouraged cooperation and discouraged competition. Let's preserve these property relations, the argument here goes, for the antidote they may offer to the alienation of modern life. These are obviously different ways of recasting this collision, but both share the common idea that there was this common property relation represented by Spain and Mexico, and there was this private property relation depicted as at the heart of US colonial administration, and they collided. And one rationalized that result, and one lamented its loss. This is such a common way of understanding land-grant dispossession that for a long time it went completely unexamined in historical studies. It was just taken for granted that common property land grants were based on and only on common property because of some commitment to egalitarianism or some sort of close-knit community that operated differently than the atomized one we live in. It was just a better way of organizing ourselves, and the subtext here was that it's somehow better that we lived this way and that we could live this way again. And we're worse off for having lost it. Note how important, by the way, property and property law is in the story of a moral and just way of living. Right? In other words, it's property relations and property law that can literally create or destroy a just or unjust world. And it's common property, not private property, that, and this is the key point, right? It's always common property that defines the Spanish and Mexican land grant. That's the thing that was lost. And perhaps it's because it was so important and so taken for granted that no one bothered to notice that it was completely wrong. Common property, where it existed in New Mexico, was never an open access commons, but rather a village-level resource organized around exclusion. Property is always about exclusion, and therefore always about violence. Members of a land grant, for example, excluded non-members from the use of the common resources and expected the state to enforce those exclusions. In the early 1800s, that enforcement usually took the form of retaliatory raids against the Utes, for example, in Tierra Amarilla. In a land grant, like in all property regimes, common property and private property were opposite sides of the same kind of coin. They always existed together. There is no such thing as private property, for example, without common property, and vice versa. There were private rights to land in community land grants, such as the private home site, for example, and these were alienable property claims. Land grant members could sell their land to outsiders, who upon purchase would enter into the common property tenure arrangements included in that transaction. These private rights were one of the key incentives that drew settlers into the northern borderlands in the first place. These valuable private claims, however, it's important to note, could not exist without various common property obligations, like sharing water and digging acequias, sharing common grazing areas, and co-managing and using uplands for hunting and gathering and grazing. Land grant property relations, in other words, developed in relation to particular conditions and circumstances as a way to manage and exploit important resources within the unique challenges of settling a dangerous and semi-arid region. And before we get romantic about this, let's consider the communities you live in. You cannot sustain your private claims to the land you own and the homes you live in without all the common property that makes it possible. The roads, the parks, the schools, the water and sewer systems that you rely on. Instead of digging acequias, we pay our water and sewer bill. That's not romantic, that's an obligation. And it was also an obligation in the same way to the people who lived in Spanish and Mexican land grants in New Mexico. So despite the importance of common property to community land grant reproduction, local land grant communities placed no real emphasis at the time on common property over private property. And when we see it this way, we see that Spanish and Mexican land grants were entirely consistent with the kinds of liberal notions of property that US territorial colonial officials claimed as their privileged domain. In fact, far from offering a sort of contradiction to US property relations, the Mexican colonization laws in the 1820s are precisely the kind of liberal property laws that we would recognize today in this country. But the territorial officials could not recognize. And this brings me to myth number 2. The idea that land grant dispossession was an event that happened in the distant past. This is, of course, related to that first myth, right? In other words, if land grant dispossession is this collision between two imaginary legal systems, then understanding land grant dispossession is just understanding the moment of their collision. There is therefore then a before dispossession and an after dispossession, and we're apparently living in the after dispossession. Every history of the Tierra Amarilla land grant, for example, contributes to this view, emphasizing the importance of the 1890s as a period when speculators acquired deeds out from under the Mexican land grant settlers that lived there through nefarious means and dispossessed them. Some of those stories, histories pick up the story in 1967 when the courthouse raid and just sort of wonder what explains the nearly 100 years between dispossession and popular outrage. We can't answer that question when we think of dispossession as an historical event that just happened. But what if I told you that dispossession was not an event, but a structure and one that is ongoing? That the struggles of the present in New Mexico over land and water have everything to do with the past, that dispossession never ended at all. You'd probably start by wondering, well, what happened between 1890 and the courthouse raid in 1967? And the answer, it turns out, would be a lot. And this is what I set out to do in my book, Properties of Violence. When my editor asked me what years my book would examine, I said, I intended to examine the years between the first Spanish explorations of the Tierra Amarilla Valley in 1776 until about, say, Thursday. And it ended up being about a year earlier. I stopped about 2011. That's what it ended up being. The first thing I realized when I examined that period, the period that's usually ignored by historians for having nothing of importance happening, is that if dispossession happened in 1890s like the historians tell us, somebody forgot to tell the land grant residents that lived there, because people continued to live there. They continued to use the acequias after dispossession apparently happened. They continued to use the uplands after dispossession apparently happened. They continued to graze their animals in the same places their parents did and their kids would after them, even after dispossession apparently. Fences did arrive in Tierra Amarilla in 1919, so they just cut them down and continued to use the land grant like they always had. But by the late 1920s, they realized they needed a permanent solution to the challenge that private property, the version of private property the United States had in mind, the challenge that offered to their claims. And so they went to court. And much of my book examines these really sophisticated, dramatic court cases that happened really from the early 1930s all the way up into the 1960s, just before Alianza. And they went to court to protect their claims, and the courts couldn't make heads or tails out of their claims. The land grant residents could demonstrate to the courts this long history of use. But this seems strange to the courts because there seemed to be multiple owners for the same property. No one person could claim it, and their use was uneven. Sometimes they had larger herds, so they used more land. Sometimes they had smaller herds, so they used less land. Right? It appeared uneven and didn't make sense to the courts. And they were losing court cases. But these were smart people. And what they came to realize was that in US common law, the courts saw property as a kind of performance. some people behave like owners. Others behave like trespassers. Owners make improvements, such as they build fences, they dig wells, they erect no trespassing signs, and they graze animals. All of these are kinds of performances, acts. Performances that the law searches for when they look for property, and when they don't find these performances, they don't find property. And so land grant heirs started performing their property. They even wrote their own deeds to the land they claimed and filed it with the county clerk. They cut private fences and erected their own. They erected no trespassing signs, like this one here. This is a photo taken by the district attorney, Alfonso Sanchez. To him, this was just insane that they would just put up no trespassing signs. All of these, what were seen by the courts and by law enforcement officials as provocative tactics, were just efforts by land grant heirs to make their claims legible and persuasive to the courts. They were doing precisely what the courts asked them to do, behave like an owner. But property, they realized, is not just a performance. Anyone can behave like a property owner, but if that behavior is not rooted in a deed, in documentary evidence, you're just a trespasser. And by the way, if anyone's interested during Q&A to talk about the notion of adverse possession, which is a way to sort of claim property without being the original owner, I'm happy to do that. They develop really sort of sophisticated ways to interrupt the court's refusal to acknowledge what they recognize as adverse possession. And that's sort of too much detail to go in here, but I'm happy to sort of talk more about that later. So the entire struggle in Tierra Amarilla, really between the 30s and the 60s, was this legal struggle over who gets to perform like a property owner and who gets called a trespasser, and who has the best legal instrument, document, to establish that. For the courts, by the way, what was actually happening on the ground didn't matter. The fact that people had lived there, and their parents had lived there, and their grandparents had lived there, and their great-grandparents had lived there, didn't matter. What mattered is this rancher that never had lived there in his life and lived in Colorado right now, but had a piece of paper, he was the owner. Right? That's what the courts determined. And local authorities were increasingly alarmed and baffled by what they considered just provocative tactics. The courts were too. In one court case, the heirs performed like property owners and demonstrated they had been on the land for more than 20 years, some of them for 50 years. But the courts called them trespassers because they didn't have a deed. They didn't have a piece of paper that could be traced back to a first owner. So the heirs organized themselves and went to court again, and this time they produced the deeds that they had filed with the county clerk, and this time the court said, well, yes, you have the deed, but you don't have this long history of use. They were caught in this sort of Joseph Heller novel of this catch-22. So in response, the heirs began ratcheting up their effort to combine the two things, to produce this documentary evidence of a deed and to demonstrate this long history of use. So they began publishing weekly warnings in local newspapers directed at private ranchers. And the notices would include short statements, one that read, quote, "You are respectfully notified to remove all improvements installed and used in said premises and restrain and not make any further improvements of any kind whatsoever to be accomplished and complete by November 30, 1943. They compiled a list of private ranchers in the Tierra Amarilla area who grazed livestock on the grant, and they flooded the valley with a deluge of eviction letters and rental bills mailed to, and sometimes they even personally delivered these eviction letters or rental bills to private ranchers, and each letter demanded rental income of 10 cents per head for all livestock on land grant property. But they kept losing in the courts on the question of color of title. And again, we could talk about this more in the Q&A, but the short version of this, and I'm sure there's probably lawyers in the room, you could claim to have lived on land for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, but if you don't have that deed, you're not an owner. But if you have demonstrated adverse possession to this land over that period, and in different states they have different amounts of time you have to demonstrate that, you can produce your own document and then acquire that land through adverse possession. So they were doing everything the court expected, everything the court required, but the court was continually found against them. And it had everything to do with the idea that common property doesn't fit, right? But by the way, this wasn't 1890, this was like 1960, right? It was ongoing, this legal struggle that continued. They decided, well, if the court won't listen to won't recognize our individual titles, they decided to hold a county election for a land grant board. And the courts, because the courts wanted one owner, not multiple owners for one property. So they invested the authority in this land grant board to serve as that one owner to recognize their interests. And all of the private ranchers sued them in federal court, recognizing the cloud that this would place on their title. And they lost in that case as well. These are really, by the way, dramatic court cases with really remarkable testimony that I cover in detail in the book. And ultimately, it is a story about the creation of private property in Tierra Amarilla. That over the course of 5 court cases, the courts telescoped into the past a version of property that they constructed in the present and then imagined as having always been there, as a way to dispossess land grant heirs of their land. Like, this dispossession was happening, ongoing, in courts from the 30s until the 60s. And again, it was not the sort of acts of courts in the 1890s or the acts of speculators in the 1890s that dispossessed them of their land, right? Rather, it was the law, which had become an arena of this struggle for land grant dispossession and remains an arena. Law was ultimately a means of dispossession. So I don't have time to go into more detail on the sort of specifics of that struggle, but let me, by way of conclusion, finish by briefly pointing out that the land grant struggle we're familiar with, the sensational one that appears to begin with the courthouse raid in 1967, has absolutely everything to do with this legal struggle over property that I just narrated. Once the courts decided in the 1960s that Tierra Amarilla was and always was private property, the land grant heirs became suddenly trespassers. Remember, property law, in order to be lawful, requires enforcement. And enforcement doesn't just imply violence, it requires it. So in 1966, well after they were supposed to have stopped making these claims, they continued. This is just months before the courthouse raid, and the land grant heirs in Tierra Amarilla begin again to start performing their property. They claim to be the legal authorities for the land grant, and then they alone could distribute grazing permits, not the private owners of this land. And as a result of this, because of these tactics, which they had been using for 30 years by this time, right? They became the lawless element, the trespassers. And their members became targets, particularly of local law enforcement, even the FBI, who was surveilling Tiarina and Alianza for years. Their members were harassed, frequently arrested. Many of them were members of Alianza, led by Reyes Lopez Tiarina. This is a picture of Jose Maria Martinez, who was one of the leaders of the Tierra Amarilla land grant. He was one of the 11 arrested the days before the courthouse raid. Arrested because they thought they were going to seize control of the land grant by violent means, but in fact what they were up to was merely an effort to behave like property owners. They were putting up no trespassing signs, confronting people who were hunting or fishing on what they considered the land grant commons and demanding that they pay for a permit. But to the district attorney, they were just communists. Right? It became this question of communism, but not a property rights struggle, which is what it was. Their arrests of Jose Maria and others, were the provocation that resulted in the famous courthouse raid of 1967, an event at the time that baffled most people in New Mexico, right? But was really just a result of the violent enforcement of private property produced by the courts. Now, this seems like a good place for me to step aside, because in order to go any further, I have to start talking about Reyes Lopez Tiarina, and introducing him to you is Ramon's job. So I'll step aside and we could take this up further in Q&A. Thank you very much.